Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. I'm Andy Lipman at the MIT Media Laboratory, and I want to thank you for joining this session of Media Lab Perspectives. Perspectives is a periodic series we hold at the Media Lab where we invite distinguished speakers to present, in this case virtually, although I will admit that it's a lot more fun when it's actually there and when most of you are in person. The series is noted for bringing to us and you a series of speakers who are stimulating and provocative. And I'm sure that today's will be both. Let me begin by introducing Joaquin Quinero Candela, who is our guest and speaker for the day. I've come to know Joaquin over the last several months, and so I think we can call each other friends now. So, let's for the moment say that. But just to get things going, until September of this year, 2021, Joaquin was the distinguished technical lead for responsible AI at Facebook, where he led the strategy for areas like fairness, inclusiveness, robustness, privacy, transparency, and accountability. Before that, he built and taught a new machine learning course at the University of Cambridge, worked at Microsoft Research, and conducted postdoctoral research at 3 institutions in Germany, including the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics. He got his PhD from the Technical University of Denmark and the Max Planck Institute for Artificial Intelligence. Post-Facebook, he serves on the board of directors of the Partnership on AI, an organization interested in the societal consequences of artificial intelligence, and is a member of the Spanish government's advisory board on artificial intelligence. And among other things, include learning the guitar, which you might well see in the background there. Well, I got to admit, it's a very yin and yang guitar. And Joaquin is considering what the next steps will be. And your questions will bring that out. I should remind you that I welcome your questions. We're going to have a discussion, and hopefully that's going to be led and include all of you. So please type your questions in Slido, the link for which is at the bottom of the screen on which you're watching that. Joaquin's prepared a few opening remarks, and then we'll begin our conversation, and we'll end promptly at 1 o'clock. So over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and welcome everybody. Very excited to be here. I think the format we're going to use today is that I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then Andy and I will engage in a fireside chat, hopefully reflecting some of your questions as well. If you see me look down, it's because I prepared some bullet points. I'm going to be using this to guide my introduction. The first thing to share with all of you is that about 15 years ago, I took my first fork in my career when I decided to join industry. I joined Microsoft Research in Cambridge in the UK, a vibrant group with people like Chris Bishop, whom some of you might know. And then what happened almost immediately is that 2007 was a time where computational advertising was really taking off, right? And this was a model where machine learning was used to predict whether someone would click on an ad. And then that prediction was used to rank ads and show them to people in a personalized way. And the consequence of that change is that advertisers were only charged if someone clicked on their ad, which decreased the cost of acquiring customers dramatically. And it was also one of the most large scale and almost like immediate impact applications of ML. So I started to work on that as a researcher at first. And long story short, the algorithms we built ended up being the ones that shipped with the Bing search engine when it launched in summer of 2009. And I was asked to leave Microsoft Research and join the Bing organization as an engineering manager to lead the click prediction team, which I did. And I think that was a pivotal moment because I became completely passionate about shipping impact at scale through ML and actually putting ML to work in practice. In some ways, reflecting back, I think I became a little bit of an impact junkie. I know that's a bit of a self-derogatory term, but it's addictive when you ship things to production and you see results. It's exhilarating in many ways. So that was 2009. Then I joined Facebook in 2012. And we relocated with my family from the UK here. And the two reasons why I joined Facebook were, the first one is the Arab Spring in 2011, where platforms like Facebook and Twitter were being used for society to mobilize and overthrow authoritarian regimes. Having lived and grown up in Morocco as a kid when my parents moved there from Spain, I was and remained very connected emotionally to the Arab world. So this was a really significant positive impact of social media from my perspective. The second thing is I visited a friend in March 2012 here in the Bay Area where I live. And I hung out with him at Facebook. And I remember sitting there talking to people, and I was sitting next to this engineer, and I asked, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm redeploying the site. And I'm like, what do you mean you're redeploying the site? Facebook was mostly a website at the time. You and whose army? Who's helping you? Where is the quality assurance team? It's like, no, we have this way of doing it, BitTorrent, and we have this canary system to check for errors and so on. And I'm like, wow, that is incredible. And I thought, I just need to be here, right? Like the purpose of it is amazing. And then the culture where individuals are trusted with something as important as redeploying the entire site is incredible. So I thought I belong here. So I joined Facebook initially to work on machine learning in ads. And that was the beginning of a pretty amazing story. For context, when I joined Facebook in 2012, there was mostly two big applications of ML. One of them was feed ranking, and the other one was ranking ads. But when I joined the ads team, what I found is, first of all, the team was minuscule. It was a couple of people doing ML only. And both the technology used, I used to refer to it as a Soyuz, it's robust and reliable and it works, but it's not fancy at all. At the time, neural networks were not being used to rank ads. And also the processes to go from applied research to shipping a model to production were extremely fragmented, painful, and slow. And it would take way too long to go from research to production. So I was faced with a dilemma. And the dilemma was, should I invest on building much fancier and advanced models with the existing infrastructure we have? Or should we actually clean the kitchen, press a stop button, realize that, as I would often say, wizards don't scale? Right? If you don't have the right infrastructure and tools, you can hire as many ML experts as you want, but it's going to be a slow process to go from research to production. So I made the bet to clean the kitchen and what I would call build the factory. And the vision behind this was that we were going to build a full ML stack that would allow everyone in the ads organization, whether they were predicting clicks or whether they were predicting conversions, whether they were looking at ads on mobile or on web. Another interesting thing, and I'll talk about that later again, is that when I joined in 2012, most of the ads were shown on web only on the right-hand column. And when I joined, there were no ads on mobile, right? But of course, usage on mobile was spiking. So we had multiple surfaces, multiple types of events to predict, and multiple groups of individuals predicting these different things, building models that didn't talk to each other and that were very difficult to reuse. And I thought we need none of that. We need a universal, incredibly flexible platform and set of tools that allows everybody to collaborate by design, where you can actually see any model that anyone else has built trivially. You can clone it, replicate it. You can look at what input features are they using. You can look at the learning curves, right? You can actually, most importantly, know who is doing what. And then you have a record. You have almost like exquisite experimental bookkeeping, so you don't have to redo the same experiment someone else did. That was the vision, and that's what we built. And it worked really well. It really helped us speed up research to production dramatically. We went from many weeks, maybe up to 2 months, down to shipping many models every single week. And that paid off. That paid off in spades. So what happened then is that other teams like feed, ranking, search, looked at what we had done and said, well, can we adopt this platform? And we started to work. We were very selective. We thought, well, feed seems to be the most impactful next application, of course. So we teamed up and we joined forces, and we ended up building the platform and set of tools that are used still today across the entire company for every single application of ML at Facebook. That success led to a change where I left the ads team and I was asked to build a centralized team at Facebook called Applied ML or AML for short. And the charter of this team was indeed to almost democratize the use of ML. And the strategy that I thought we should follow was a three-pronged one. The first one was make it really easy for engineers, even if you don't have an ML background, to put ML in their products through automation, through building services where you just provide a data set, and what you get is you get a trained predictor, and you get a hook point that you can hit to get predictions on demand, right? Just make it very easy. The second aspect of the strategy was, well, we need to innovate, right? Let's remember we still have these Soyuz, right? These the Soyuz were gradient boosted decision trees as a way to almost generate categorical features, if you will, and then followed by real-time online trained logistic regression, which was, pretty sparse and massive capacity, right? Very robust. It works, right? But also very limited compared to the deep and wide neural nets we have right now. So the second aspect of the strategy was we need to innovate in model architectures, in learning paradigms, and then the third aspect of the strategy was a little bit that quote that is attributed, I guess, to a combination of Steve Jobs and Henry Ford. If I had people what they wanted, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said, I want a faster horse. We needed to also create demos and prototypes of things teams across the company weren't asking for because they didn't know it could be done. So right now I'm using the Facebook Portal device for video conferencing. It's the first video conferencing device that's shipped with a camera, with a smart camera that tracks you and that does automatic cinematography. That was one of the demos that we built. So the third pillar was demos. So AML was widely successful in the company. Over 25% of all engineers in the company were using and are still using these tools. I left Facebook on September 7. Any statistics I have are old from when I was there. And if you think about the scale of this, if you want to do a back of the envelope calculation, imagine that any service like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Amazon for shopping, or even when you use ML for content moderation, you're looking at the order of 1 billion users a day. It depends on who you are, right? But just order of magnitude. And then typically you have in the order of 1,000 pieces of content to rank. And then if people come back to the service 10 to 100 times a day, you're looking at 10 to 100 trillion ML predictions a day. So this is a pretty unprecedentedly massive scale application of ML. The last thing that I'll say about the applied ML era in my career at Facebook is that it reminds me of the transformation Facebook went through in 2011 and 12, where Facebook realized that we needed to become, I still say we, although I don't work at Facebook, but I feel emotionally still there, that we needed to become a mobile first company, right? In 2011, Facebook was a web company. And so a centralized team was created to drive that transformation that hired masses of engineers who were experts at building things for mobile. And in a way, with Applied ML, we did the same thing. We created a centralized team that first served the entire company, but then very importantly, one part of our mission was to try and make ourselves as obsolete as possible, right? And make sure that we scaled sublinearly compared to the growth of the company, right? And to do that, we helped product teams across the company build their own ML teams to make technology transfer easier, and also to get ourselves out of the critical path. And so we ended up exporting over 150 experts over the period that I was leading the AML team to create things like the AI infrastructure team, the AI camera team, the assistant team embedded in product teams. In 2017, after an incredible period of building and scaling the Applied ML team, I was pretty burnt out. This was both exhilarating and amazing, but also fully exhausting. And I was thinking of leaving and taking some time off. And then at the 2017 NeurIPS conference, for those of you who were there or remember, I think it was a pivotal NeurIPS conference where there was a big presence of AI fairness talks. There was a tutorial given by Solon Barocas and Moritz Hart that was amazing on AI fairness. And then Kate Crawford gave a keynote on bias in AI. I think it was called The Problem with Bias. And I think that got a lot of light bulbs that had been in my mind for a long time to lit up. Back at Microsoft, when I was working on computational advertising, I remember being concerned about what features we were using as inputs for the ad rankings models. And for example, I had this open question, is it okay to use gender as an input, right? Even today, I think you can argue both sides, but what was notable is back in 2009 or 10, when I was asking myself that question, I didn't really find any guidance or anyone to talk to. In 2017, the situation was completely different. It was clear to me that we needed to urgently invest massively at Facebook on the ethics of AI in general, but on responsible AI more specifically, and even more specifically on fairness in AI. So that's what I decided to do. In early 2018, I transferred leadership of Applied ML to a dear friend, colleague who was reporting to me. And then I became an individual contributor for a while, and I started to learn a little bit more about AI fairness. And it was a kind of an interesting story, because at first I saw the work that Joey Bolamwini and Timnit Gebru were doing on computer vision and face recognition and biases. And the reason I'm smiling is that the Portal camera that I'm using right now suffered exactly from the same problems. And I have a colleague who is no longer at Facebook, Lade Obamehinti. She's a Black woman, and she was one of the engineers building this thing. And she would test it sitting on a couch together with colleagues, and the camera would often just crop her out and focus on the white dude sitting next to her. And it's one thing to read a paper about this problem, but to be in the team and see it actually exclude someone outrageously like that it makes a big impact. The other thing is I have a colleague, Isabel Kloman, who was working on fairness for job rankings. We have a product called Jobs Near You. And in there, she was asking the question, is the accuracy of the ranking equally good for people over and below 40 years old and for binarized gender, male and female? And when I looked at these two examples, I thought, okay, I've been building platforms and using math and code to solve problems at scale. I think we can do the same for fairness, and we can probably get this sorted in a couple of months. And at the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference in New York in 2018, I was at the bar before the conference started, and I was talking to people, to a community that I didn't know. And I just mentioned that vision. I'm like, hey, we've just built tools and platforms for AI for an entire company. We're going to do the same for fairness, and we're going to solve this. And then this person just turned their back to me and stopped talking to me. And I was perplexed. And they said, oh, that's just another techno-optimist engineer that doesn't know what they're talking about. And I was really perplexed. And that changed when I started to look at the ProPublica study in 2016 of the use of ML to produce risk scores assessments for risk of recidivism, to help in the criminal justice system, for judges to take that risk score as an input to decide or to inform the decision of whether to hold someone in jail while they wait for trial, or whether to let them go on bail, right? And we can talk more about that. I realize that I'm going to be running out of time soon. We can talk about that later, but what blew my mind there is that there were completely reasonable mathematical definitions of fairness that were mutually incompatible. And at first I thought, well, that's why drop-down menus were invented, right? Like I can say, well, individual fairness, or maybe, subgroup calibration versus maybe the demographic parity, right? Like we can equalize false positive rates or whatever it is, and it's fine. You just pick, right? But then I was talking to Ethan Zuckerman at some point from the MIT Media Lab about these things, and he said, well, there is a mapping between those mathematical concepts and moral philosophy definitions of fairness, and reasonable people will disagree. And he showed me this picture that many of you might have seen of 3 people of different heights trying to watch a baseball game behind a fence. And in one picture, it's labeled equality. Everyone has got one crate. And then the short person can't see, right? With only one crate. And then in the other picture is labeled equity. And the short person has got the crate of the taller person, so he's got 2 crates, and the tall person has got no crate. And then everybody can see the game, right? So you're equalizing outcomes. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought, okay, well, now I understand why that ethicist turned their back to me, because I was just missing the point. This is not primarily an AI problem, and some of these questions are not new. They're not. They're exacerbated by AI. They're not created by AI, and people have been thinking about these things for centuries. And so what I then decided to do is to build this responsible AI team in a way that was very multidisciplinary. And we did hire moral philosophers and political scientists who are still on the team. And we built a framework that starts with high-level questions on what definition of fairness makes sense for the product you're looking at. Is it going to be fair value exchange, or is it going to be a minimum or standard quality of service, or should we be looking at equal treatment, or should we actually be looking at equity, right? And then the AI and the implementation, whether you have bias in data in the algorithms or in interventions will come, right? But you don't start there. And it's been a very humbling and amazing journey. So I'm going to take a moment to look through my notes to make sure that I don't miss anything. We can talk about examples later. We made sure that the use of ML to remove election interference in India in the 2019 elections was fair under some definition of fairness, and that was fascinating work. And then there's a lot of interesting fairness questions when it comes to removing hate speech or bullying or doing content moderation in general. So to try and close, right as I was thinking of leaving Facebook for the second time, and this time for real, I embarked on the last project, and that last project was accountability in diversity and inclusion. So the thing that really again like lit up my mind dates back from 2018 at the NeurIPS conference 2018, where Yo-Yo Ma, the famous cello player, attended, and I was having a conversation with Yo-Yo, and I was asking him, what would help you trust AI? And he looked at me and he said, well, the most important thing is to understand who's building that AI and what are their intentions and motivations. And I guess that helped me build a very strong connection with another discussion that was going on and is still going on, which is whether we have AI teams that are diverse and inclusive enough. The answer is no, we don't. And I realized, oh my God, frameworks are great, tools are great, processes are great, but we also need to focus on the culture. And I spent a year working on this, and the end result is that we changed the performance review system for all managers and leaders in the AI team at Facebook to make sure that we rewarded people when they went above and beyond in diversity and inclusion, but also that we held them accountable if they didn't. And some of the myths that I discovered in a way, personally, I mean, I know other people knew them before. One of them is diversity and inclusion is often seen as a recruiting problem, mostly. I think that's wrong. I think it's mostly a retention problem and a problem of creating a culture of equality of opportunity and a culture where everyone can participate and contribute. Another one is you focus on education and people will do the right thing. I think that's wrong. People do what they get paid for. And then the third one is there's a triple whammy going on where I was in many meetings working on these diversity and inclusion performance expectations, where out of 12 people, I was the only white dude and everyone else was from an underrepresented group. And I think the triple whammy is people who are doing this work, if it doesn't get rewarded, they're working on something that doesn't get rewarded, whammy number one. The whammy number two is opportunity cost. You could be working on something else that does get rewarded. And the third one, which is actually pretty dramatic in many ways, is that if you're trying to push for change, right, and rock the boat, you can be perceived as being annoying and disruptive, right? And so you might get actually even penalized for that. I think I really need to close now because I think my 20 minutes are pretty much up. So why did I leave Facebook and what's next for me? I have no idea what's next for me, but my wife stopped working 15 years ago when our second child was born. And she's been wanting to rebuild her career, and we've tried to hire help and find ways to do it while I was working like crazy. And it just became clear to me that the only way I could help her reboot her career was by actually taking her job over, by being a stay-at-home dad and almost like push her out of all the house tasks. So this is what I've been doing, and this is what I'm doing right now, and that's my top priority. And it's way harder than I thought it would be, both because I'm not good at it, and second, because emotionally it's very difficult to go from identifying with a job where you're very busy and you get recognized for it to having none of that. What I will do, I would definitely go back to doing work because I actually enjoy working, especially on meaningful things, but I don't know if it's going to be closer to academia or closer to big tech again. So yeah, thank you for listening. That was maybe a longer introduction than you had paid for, but I'm super excited now to get into a discussion. Oh, I didn't mention that I've been thinking about social recommender systems. You may have seen the MIT Tech Review article that came out in March. I tried to focus on what are the questions that that article asks that we should be looking at, and less on whether, on how reading that article felt. But anyway, to end on a positive note, I'm extremely excited to see so much interest for building AI responsibly. And I know that I'll be engaged in this field one way or another. So I don't know how we get now. Oh, here we go. Now we get Andy back on screen.
Boy, you sure said a lot. And covered it in a short number of times, and while we're waiting for questions, and I'd like to remind everybody, type your questions in Slido, and there's a link to Slido underneath the window by which most of you are watching this. There's two questions that just come to mind immediately that are inspired by what you say, and one of them is the sort of like deadly embrace of, at a company like Facebook, spreading the gospel of AI so that it becomes accessible to all of the local teams within it, and a potential conflict with the global goals of trying to actually make it useful, functional, fair, and ethical. Because, those are decisions that may not be easily made at a micro level. But even before we think about that, there's something that's woven through your entire message that I would like to kind of like ask a little bit more about because of your experience. And that is the magic associated with the phrase AI, okay? Because the assumption is by everybody that it actually works. And that, and then what's wrong with it is, well, we feed it the wrong data, or we assess it the wrong way, or we don't have the right people designing it, or, the model may be wrong. And if we just fix the model, or if we just fix this, then it's actually going to work. But that's not, I'm not sure that's true. Like one of the key elements in a system that does the kinds of things you did is the issue of whether it's overtrained or undertrained. Okay, so in other words, but no matter how you slice the cake, it's inbred. When it makes a decision, it's making a decision based on a set of nodes, mathematical relationships that are abstracted away. So the first question is, what are the limits really that the wrong people are doing it, or the limits in part that we've invested more mental energy into it? And I apologize for the background noise, but we had a big storm here yesterday. The streets are filled with leaves and trees, and the teams are out there cleaning it up, and there's nothing I can do about the weather or the teams. Anyway, over to you.
No, thank you, Andy. For what it's worth, I can't hear the noise, so whatever noise cancellation Zoom is doing is working. It's a pretty profound question. First, I want to share, for context, that the reason for that frenzy of trying to make ML or AI, you and I have had discussions on the fact that we should probably call it ML and not AI. To make it available to everyone, it's just that you could see the impact of it, right? When we don't, if we showed newsfeed ranked in reverse chronological order with the most recent story at the top, and we survey people, we sit with them, and we look at the experience, people like it a lot less than if you actually rank it, right? So there's a difference between with and without, right? Now, the second part is the one that maybe we need to peel that onion off little by little. It is it's very tempting and easy to focus too much on the ML part, to treat it like a black box, and to forget that it lives in a broader context, right? And when you build a product that is powered by ML, the ML layer is one part of it, but I think there's a lot of other decisions that you make that are about what metrics are you building, what are your goals, but also design decisions. I'd like to give you two examples of design decisions. For the longest time in Instagram, you couldn't really share external links, right? So if you had a story that came from whatever news outlet you want, right? And imagine that it was false or fake or whatever, right? It couldn't really go viral on Instagram for a simple reason. There was no share button, right? That's not an AI thing, that's a design thing. On Facebook, there was a share button, and you could actually share content that you were not connected to directly, right? So stuff could go viral, right? You need to understand that it lives in that world. Another example, maybe in YouTube, right? Do you autoplay the next suggested video, or you actually force people to look and then pause for a second and think about what they want, right? I think that has also a very, very big impact on the experience, and it may make ML, more or less critical or impactful in what you're doing. And then maybe the third thing that I'll say is that just based on my personal experience, I think maybe the human brain, or at least my brain, is somewhat sequential. I mean, I guess that the first problem that I was confronted with is like, okay, it's extremely inefficient for people to use and deploy ML, right? It's a pain. How can we make it easier, right? That seems to be the next problem, because most of the places I look, it's going from not using it to using it is beneficial, right? And then once you're using it at scale, and once you have these closed loop systems where you have both the designers, the PMs, the data scientists building metrics, iterating on the models, shipping the new revision, and you also see how it may even change human behavior, that's where you start to think, okay, now we need to move on to the next question, right? But I couldn't think about the responsible AI question that much. And again, this is my own personal story, right? Until I had solved the first problem that was in front of me, which is we don't even have the infrastructure or the tools. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried. I think you're muted.
Right, I'm muted to avoid the noise of what's going on outside from penetrating while you're talking. When we talked about this before, there was another point that came up, and the point was, almost no matter what we build, society is going to adapt to it in kind of funny ways. And so back in the very, very early days, where the ads that appeared on the web were very rudimentary, one of my dear friends would type deliberate search requests in order to pull up the ads that he wanted, right? Like if he wanted a new phone plan, he would type in things so that AT&T and Verizon would appear as the ads. And he wasn't exactly gaming the system, but he was adapting to the fact that it did that. And so as you do these things with ads or feeds, that changes people's behavior in in how they respond and how they generate feeds. How do you fold that into the kind of picture?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about this for sure. Let me start with a simple example to illustrate what you just said, right? If you build an objective function for feed ranking where clicks get a lot of weight, right? Because your objective functions, for context, are often going to be the weighted sum of it's a linear combination of expected events, right? You're going to say, well, I'm going to give a click 5 points. I'm going to give a share 20 points. A comment is going to get 100 points or something like that, right? And if I build a new friendship with someone else, that's like 200 points or whatever, right? If you put too much weight on clicks, you will get clickbait. You will get like sensationalist, I can't believe he said that, click here to know more, right? You just get a ton of that, right? People will adapt because people want to get more distribution on the platform, right? That you got to think about people's incentives. What we also saw is that if you put too much weight on comments, then you'll get outrage. You'll get statements that cause people to react and say, well, that's not true, or I disagree with you, right? So I think that's totally, that's a thing. That's absolutely right. Another aspect of this that I think is quite interesting, I've been reading Stuart Russell's book, Human Compatible, which I recommend very highly. And he makes an interesting hypothesis that I find fascinating, which is if you take any objective function of your liking for your social media ranking algorithm. If you have a closed loop system composed of humans, data scientists who are looking at the metrics, right? Designers, product managers, ML engineers who are shipping new iterations of the model. If you think about it, if you're trying to maximize some metric, and this is a hypothesis, of course, but it's an interesting hypothesis to try and verify, you may end up trying to make people more predictable somehow, right? Like if I can create a set of users where the AI can or the ML can predict more easily whether you will click, comment, share, or whatever, you're going to be able to move your metrics better. So if there's any way in the decisions you're making to actually get there, maybe create people who are more polarized, or maybe make sure that you gravitate towards a world where, again, the content that gets created is more binary or polarized or the extremes, right? Then it might be tempting to go there. And so what Stuart Russell says is like we need to spend a lot of time thinking about the objective functions themselves. And maybe one of the key things that we need to be working on ML is to have systems that are more humble about the objective function itself, and that are willing to sort of question it. But I think it begins with humans. Like we humans need to question it, and we need to look at what we've built and how it's behaving in the wild and course correct. And then one more point I want to make on this, and I'm not an expert at all, but many of these questions are old. There is a professor of architecture at Columbia called Laura Kurgan, who's been looking at the parallels between urban planning and social recommendation algorithms, and looking at issues like homophily. What decisions in urban planning increase homophily, whereby people tend to flock with people who are similar to them, and actually increase polarization and reject people who are different, right? And could we look at algorithms for ranking in social media in the same way? And I think, Andy, you were saying overtraining or over-optimizing. The way I hear that is, what obligation do we have to keep exposing people to stuff, the algorithm might think you're not interested in, but we think it's just healthy for you to be exposed to a diversity of things, right? Versus exploiting what we know. I think these are all open questions.
I think part of what I was trying to get at is a little bit of the inbred sort of nature of internally how the algorithms work, and that it seems to me one of the problems is we just seem to put too much faith in them. I'm reminded of the previous phase of AI when everyone was enthusiastic about what it would do, and that was called expert systems. And they were programmed with 50,000 odd rules, and indeed could recommend an antibiotic, perhaps even better than, or more effective than what a physician might have known about. But you didn't know what it didn't know. and so you didn't know what rules it had. You didn't and so it was a little bit opaque. But then you could add some mechanism to trace that. But now the level of sophistication of some of these systems is such that that's fairly difficult to do. I mean, people have been trying to understand the layers of vision in the human brain for a long time, and we really, that's extremely difficult to do, and extremely difficult to do here. So the problem is we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know, what it's telling us. So I think part of what Joy Buolamwini's thesis was all about was, hey, look, if you get your recognition algorithm up from 83% to 93%, have you done any good at all? That's one dimension of it. And you've certainly touched on that. And the other dimension is, how are we going to know even that we've done that? Go ahead, and I'm going to turn to some of the questions from some of the people who are watching us in a moment. So back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Two thoughts on that. Funnily, I did my PhD thesis in probabilistic machine learning in Gaussian processes, and I became quite militant about the need for any algorithm to produce a measure of confidence about the prediction and the dangers of not doing that. And if I decide to go back to academia somehow, I might very well pick back, the whole probabilistic ML idea, because I think it's essential. But the second one is there's always going to be humans involved in these closed loop systems with ML and people, and that just takes me back to both diversity and inclusion, but also participatory governance, right? So to give you a couple of examples, you can be happily working on using ML to find and eliminate hate speech, right? And you can think that you're doing very well because maybe the accuracy of the predictions keeps increasing, where the ground truth is you have a bunch of humans that have some community standards, some community guidelines that you're paying, and then they label content and they tell you, what the accuracy, what the precision recall of the algorithm is being, etc., right? And you can feel good about yourself. But then if you don't have the right people in the room, you might not be aware that maybe hate speech against Black people in the US has a different meaning or impact than hate speech against another group or across gender, right? And maybe you need to zoom out a little bit and think again about maybe my objective function isn't quite right here, or maybe my policies aren't quite right. So I think one necessary condition, not sufficient, is really to embrace the discomfort of having multidisciplinary teams with people from different backgrounds who will ask annoying questions that at first you don't understand, but then you sit down and you think about them. I think that discipline, that hygiene is essential, right? And then zooming out from that, I think there's a question of participatory governance. Facebook has got this external oversight board that can overrule Facebook's decisions on content moderation. I think that's good. I think it doesn't scale, but I think it's good. It's a good first step. How do you build scalable models for participatory governance? If you're Airbnb, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and you're concerned, right? Again, to bring the discussion back to the US and to civil rights, you're concerned about, is there bias or racism that pops up in the algorithms, and how would I measure it? Well, I would need to measure by race in the US. How do you do that, right? Who should hold the data? How do I engage civil society and civil rights organizations in that conversation to make sure that I'm not making the decision about pros and cons on my own, right? I know that this sort of deviates quite a bit from the use of ML, but an ML engineer like me might say, well, I can infer it. I can just build an algorithm that predicts, race or ethnicity. Well, you gotta be careful. You're gonna zoom out and understand, what does that mean and why would you want to do it or not? So did we get questions, Andy, from the audience?
Yeah, we do. We have quite a few, and let me see if I can put a couple of them together. because the topics that you're covering cover much more than AI. They cover, you know, you said you went to Facebook in 2012 because that was after the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And that was a period of time when that kind of optimism that the technology really could be a force for good in the world was pretty strong. I remember it well, and we all cared. And then came things like the 2016 election and the current discussion about Facebook now, which is you know the flip side of that.
Yeah.
And so we have questions, you know, about how you fit machine learning into that. And one of the things, you know, you can do is to say, wait, back up. We're not going to make it any better because we're afraid of what happens when it does. People have a tendency to believe machines, and people have a tendency to, as you've said, you know, game the system and, you know, and introduce a lot of inauthentic interactions, you know, in the course of using it. And where's the accountability associated with the designers of AI? Okay, themselves. Maybe okay to have a board of overseers looking at the content, but you know, what is the board of overseers that we envision for AI? So there's a slew of questions that are, it's hard to distill them into a single thing, but that's the tenor of concerns that many have.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The January 6th Capitol riots of this year, in many ways, have a strong parallel to the Arab Spring, pretty much a decade earlier, right? It's the same mechanisms. And one of the first questions is, what role does ML play in amplifying certain content versus other content, right? Twitter, a couple of days ago, released a really nice study that looked at content and publishers across the political ideology spectrum, and then asked the question, you know, is there more amplification of a content that is right-leaning or left-leaning? And honestly, I don't really care so much about the findings, especially because Twitter also is very transparent about the fact that they have no idea why the results are the way they are. You know, the results, for those of you who haven't read the study, say that counter to intuition or what people expected, that right-leaning content gets more amplified than left-leaning content. To me, the interesting thing is a transparency exercise, much less than the results, because I suspect that the results could have been different depending on what's going on right now in politics and what stories are coming, you know, more from the left, right? So I could totally see it flip, right? I think the most important thing here really is that we absolutely need to look at outcomes. It's essential to look at how is a product working in the wild. And imagine a world, let me just paint a vision. Imagine a world where YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, any social media platform has got ways to share almost in real time what content is going viral. One thing that's interesting is that, you know, every platform has different privacy rules where, you know, stories that I only share with my friends can't really go viral because I'm not that popular. I have like a few, you know, 100 friends, but it's not, I don't have millions of friends, right? So it tends to be public content anyway, right? That goes viral. But imagine if you could actually take it to the public sphere, right? The discussion of like, hey, here's in real time a dashboard. Here's the stuff that's going viral right now in each of the platforms, right? And different people will have different ideas on what, you know, depending on where your bar for freedom of speech is. You may have your own personal and also cultural, you know, induced opinion on where you should draw the line. But at least if you had those discussions in the public sphere, I think that would be a very powerful way to then understand, you know, what changes we want to make, if any. Now, on accountability, my opinion is that the accountability has to be end-to-end, right? Like you need to have someone accountable for how your product is working in the wild. As someone who used to be an ML engineer, you know, trying to make the algorithm work and trying to make the algorithm predict whatever we had all agreed it should predict, I should be held accountable for expectations of responsible AI. If there are privacy guidelines, I should 100% respect them. And if I violate them, because I'm the person who actually plugs in the data, then I should be held accountable. If there are guidelines for assessing whether there's bias in the predictions or accuracy, I should be held accountable for that 100%, right? But I think there's a place where the accountability has to be higher up, right? In deciding what is the goal of the product, right? In deciding even what are the metrics we're going to be optimizing overall. I think it's unreasonable to put all of the accountability on the ML engineer. I think the organization as a whole should be accountable for these things.
That sounds good. It also, well, I mean, it potentially maybe a little bit late, because in order for them to understand it, it has to go out there and have its impact. Because there are other dimensions to that. I think when we were talking earlier, you made the point that there were two areas that you worked on. One was feeds and the other was ads. And I have to admit, I don't know exactly what an ad is today, because an ad is anything that somebody can pay to put up. So an ad can be of a sort of political influence, or it can be selling toothpaste or cell phones. And if I get an ad that tells me to buy a toothpaste I don't particularly want, that's not particularly interesting or harmful or distressing to society. On the other hand, if there's a profusion of paid content or ads that's related to political things, that's a completely different matter. So one of the questions is there a difference in the AI itself between these trillion transaction systems like advertising and low volume systems? Some of the people you worked with must have been working on lower volumes, like hiring, for example, or things like that. I knew that would give you a little bit of pause.
It's a shame that, yeah, it's so difficult to do these things over Zoom, because if we were in a room together, then I'd engage in a conversation with a person that asked that question to try and understand the intent behind the question. So I'll do my best to answer it with the first thing that comes to my mind, but I think it's going to be probably a disappointingly technical answer. And I don't know if the question was more about policy, then I need to know more about what lies behind it. So the commonality is that a lot of the platforms and tools are very similar and are shared, and that's a good thing. So, for example, if you think about low prevalence integrity applications, these are low volume. Some of them are low volume. Removing particularly horrible or egregious content from the site, of which you don't see a lot, right? Luckily. And imagine that content requires analyzing a video, for example, right? And just to call the elephant in the room, I guess we have the Christchurch terrorist attack that was live streamed, right? That's a video that you would want to be able to detect very quickly. You don't have a lot of training data of that kind, right? You just don't, right? But because you have a unified platform, what you do is that you train universal embeddings for text, for speech, for computer vision, and you actually are able to do a lot of transfer learning where you can benefit from massive scale models for feed or for ads to learn representations that are extremely powerful, right? Where then you only need a small handful of labels to be able to learn for a new domain, right? And an example that is less dramatic than terrorism would be, for example, machine translation, where not only in Facebook, but across the board, there's a lot of amazing work on cross-lingual embeddings and cross-lingual learning, where if you want to learn, a classifier, actually, we can go back to dramatic examples, to low resource languages, right? Like Burmese, where we've also seen a lot of concerns of integrity and misinformation in Burma, or Myanmar, where with very little labeled data, you're able to build NLP models that work quite well. So that was more the technical side of the answer, and I'm sorry that we can't engage in a conversation, and I can understand the depth of the question.
Well, I'll pursue that further. As people use video more and more, it seems to me, well, and naively one would say that's an insurmountable problem. I mean, like, imagine just something simple. Forget a mass assault, but just something simple like it's probably not a good idea to propagate videos of people swallowing Tide Pods, right? I mean, that's probably something we, responsibly would not want propagated too far without at least some sort of warning or rejoinder there. But I don't think any of those videos actually say, watch him eat this Tide Pod. There are probably a bunch of people standing around saying, look at this, isn't that amazing? And, and I don't know how you would do it in a world of images and, and in the world of sounds that's associated with videos. I don't even know how you would begin. And so that even if you did manage to, do better at a company or organization having a pervasive end-to-end holistic view of how it wants to position what's coming out of it, and the AI is one component of it, the impact is another, and so on. But the fact that you're a little bit of a forum and you're in a complex multidimensional world like video, is there any chance of even understanding that? And what scale would you have to do that at?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So there's been quite a bit of work and successful work at multimodal learning, where you train simultaneously on the video content, on the audio, both the audio and if there's any language that is spoken on that as well, and also surrounding text, because often there are comments or a description or something like that. And some of the interesting applications, for example, have been on finding drug sales on Facebook, where the language never says, hey, do you want some meth, or do you want some pills or some illegal substance, right? It's always pseudonyms, and this language actually keeps evolving all the time, right? And then the images themselves, they kind of are very suggestive, but they're not exactly the same. They're not exactly the thing. I remember our CTO Shrep had this nice illustration where I think there was some broccoli tempura taken, at a certain angle that looked very similar to marijuana, but wasn't. And to a human reviewer, you would be confused between the two. But you can actually train computer vision these days to actually be more accurate than people. And also, you can learn models that are able to discern whether the soundtrack or the audio or the text matches or doesn't match the images. You do need large data sets, and you do need labels, right? And annotations are very expensive. One of the things that keeps fueling progress in complex tasks like these ones, or maybe even like deep fake detection and stuff like that, right? Because you haven't gone there yet, but you may be going there too, because that's a pretty tough one, right? Is public data sets, right? Few organizations have the resources to label things at scale. And whenever large tech companies release to the world high quality labeled data sets, I think that helps everybody, right? So you could imagine, if we want to take a bit of an optimistic spin here, right? I think if we saw more of that, if we saw, most of the, $1 trillion plus, valuation companies contribute more high quality labeled data sets, I think that'd be for the common good, for sure.
I think shining the clear light of scrutiny on the data sets and the algorithms and the way that we do things is certainly at least one part of a productive path forward. And that kind of transparency would probably do Facebook, as well as everyone else, a lot of good now. We're at the end of our hour. I want to thank you for spending the time with us and bringing that wealth of experience and insight to what's a truly important issue. And I'd like to thank everyone out there for joining us and asking questions. And stay tuned again for the next Media Lab Perspective series. We'll announce the date soon, and we'll see you again. So long for today.
Thank you, Andy.